One of the things that I have said I like about this Bible reading schedule is that it spaces the Gospels out throughout the year so that you don't just read them all at once and then never come back to the stories and teachings of Jesus, but you get them throughout. And so here we are, over halfway through the year, and we come back to the first book of the New Testament, to the Gospel of Matthew, and we'll spend the next 5 or 6 weeks here. So let's see what we have in the first 5 chapters. Lots to talk about, and several themes that become clear in the book of Matthew. A few things that we'll point out from the beginning. The first verse of the book describes that Jesus is the King, the Messiah, the Son of David, and is that king language that we want to notice in the beginning of Matthew. Basically, in every chapter, we have a reference to Jesus being king. In chapter 1, we are given his genealogy, and he comes from the line of the kings, not only David, but the other kings of Judah. In chapter 2, he is worshipped as a king by the Magi, or the wise men that come to him when he is born. In chapters 3 and 4, first John and then Jesus will say themselves that they are announcing the coming of the kingdom. And so it is in that framework then that in chapter 5 Jesus goes up on the mount and starts to teach about his kingdom. Jesus is introduced as the king, the Messiah, the Son of David, and he is coming and early on telling us about that kingdom, and we'll say more about that in just a second. But the other thing, and maybe even more obvious in these first few chapters of Matthew, is the emphasis that's put on Jesus as the fulfillment of the scriptures, and I think even more than that, the fulfillment of the story of Israel. It's hard to miss Matthew over and over again saying, and this will continue throughout his gospel, these things happened because it was written, and there's a quotation or a scripture referred to that Jesus is fulfilling in some way. But I think in a deeper sense we see from the beginning that Jesus is embodying the story of Israel. He is showing himself to be the Son of God. Remember, Israel was described as God's son, but failed in that regard. Now Jesus comes as the true Son of God and fulfills what Israel could not be. Just think about how when Jesus is born, because of Joseph and his dreams, they end up going to Egypt to escape a murderous tyrant who is killing the babies, and then coming out of Egypt like the Israelites before him. We then learn about him being baptized, passing through the water in chapter 3, and then from the water going directly into the wilderness in chapter 4, where he faces temptation. And this is obviously the critical difference, that while Israel failed when they were tempted in the wilderness, Jesus succeeds. And then from the wilderness to chapter 5, going up on the mountain to give a new law. So we see again, Jesus not just checking off the things that were predicted in the Old Testament, but in a much deeper sense, fulfilling the story of Israel and showing himself to be, in that sense, the Son of God. And then we'll just say a little bit about the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, which we'll read the rest of next week. But we've said some things before, I think, in the Gospel of Luke about the upside-down kingdom that Jesus announces. That becomes very clear in the Beatitudes. It's the poor, the mourning, the hungry, the persecuted. They're the ones that are going to inherit this great kingdom. But with that kind of lowliness, with that kind of humility that is a prerequisite for the kingdom citizen, the transformation of the gospel will happen from the inside out. And so those that will become the salt of the earth, the light of the world, are those that will have a righteousness exceeding the scribes and the Pharisees, because they look at themselves and they don't just not murder, not commit adultery, so on and so forth, but their hearts are transformed from the inside out. So a lot more we could say, and I'm sure a lot more that you will see in these chapters, but that's the beginning of Matthew, and we'll continue in it next week.